Welcome to Turn the Page, the official podcast of the Syosset Public Library.
Hi, this is Jessica with Syosset Library's podcast, Turn the Page. And I literally feel like we did just talk 5 minutes ago. Christina Henry, how are you?
I'm good. I'm very happy to be back with you.
The last book that we talked about was called Good Girls Don't Die.
Hmm.
And we did chat a little bit towards the end, and you mentioned that you had this book, The House That Horror Built, coming out. And
Hmm.
I jumped right on that. I think I jumped off that podcast and immediately onto the email with your publicist, like, okay, so how do I get this one on my slate? And I did, and I loved it. So, welcome back. I'll see you in another 5 minutes about your next.
I know.
Sure. But tell us about the house that horror built and sort of where the whole story came from.
So it's about a single mom named Harry Adams who, uh, in the midst of the pandemic, when everything was very difficult in terms of jobs, gets his job working as a house cleaner for a very reclusive horror director who has like this collection of props in his house. And I kind of wanted to write um I wanted to write a haunted house story. I wanted to write a story with a single mom. And then I was inspired by, I think, two different things. I think one of them is pretty obvious. I love Rebecca, by Daphne du Maurier. And this is not exactly that type of Gothic, but it's inspired by that type of Gothic. Um, and I think that it shows that DNA pretty clearly. And then the other thing is, I've seen over the years all these interviews with different horror movie directors who have these huge collections of props. Like John Landis has all these props that he collects. Peter Jackson has all these props that he collects. Del Toro has all these props he collects. And I started thinking about like what would it be like to just kind of have all these things around you and the possibilities of that.
So I have to say, I do love the idea that you wrote a haunted house story. First of all, I am a big fan of haunted house stories. However, I think just the idea of writing a haunted house story that takes place anytime around COVID is perfect because I think like we were all kind of haunting our own houses during that time.
Yes.
Yeah, we all lived in a haunted house in some way.
Hmm.
And there was this really weird sense of isolation, whether you were in some sort of bubble or not. And I really felt that from Harry, who is the main character, and her son Gabriel. And I thought that they were a really good starting point for us to walk into the house of this horror director, this horror movie creator. And yeah, Bright Horses was an interesting place. So the story takes place in Chicago.
Hmm.
Any particular reason you chose that as the city where this would be set?
I live here.
Oh,
So
that's okay. So that's good.
yeah,
So
yeah,
you have inside knowledge.
yeah. And the house itself was not inspired by any particular house, but there is a neighborhood that's a little bit north of me where you start to get what I think of as sort of atypical city housing, right? So like the street where I live, it's mostly multifamily, the houses are right on top of each other. And then there's like this area that's a little bit further north where you start to see these houses that are like on two lots or three lots and they have actual lawns. And you're saying to yourself, okay, I wonder who lives in that kind of house. So I remember I was out walking one day and I did pass a house that was absolutely enormous, I think, for anywhere, but particularly for a city. And I was like, hmm. I just started to think, okay, because you kind of need to have, I think I think you can have a haunted house in a small space, but it's not quite the same, is it? Like the big thing about haunted houses is you need empty spaces. You need large empty spaces, that where there's not enough people to fill the rooms.
Carrie herself, she's very much on her own with Gabriel, who is her son.
Hmm.
And she comes from a background where horror movies were definitely not appropriate. She comes
Hmm.
from a very religious background, and there was something about just sort of the forbiddenness of it that drew her in. And I love that sort of her first introduction to horror was, I think, The Lost Boys.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I think I picked that because it was probably I would not say it was the first horror movie I saw. I think it was probably one of the first horror movies I saw that I became really attached to. I'm a Gen Xer, which means that like I grew up in the videotape era, and whenever I went to a sleepover, we watched horror movies. So I think the first horror movie I remember watching actually is Nightmare on Elm Street. I was 10. It was a different time. And but I think Lost Boys was one of the first horror movies I remember really loving, when I was younger. Because not just because it was scary and it was gory, but it was also like stylish in a way that I really hadn't seen in too many other movies.
Yeah, and it is very, very 80s in so many ways
Hmm.
too. There's a lot about it, I think, that was kind of a different way to do vampires than had been done up until that point.
Hmm.
And I liked that there's a point later in the story where you're kind of going back and forth to the present from Harry, and then sort of after she left her family, where she sort of relates what she's going through to Star, who is like the only girl, the only female character really in that
Hmm.
whole movie. And I thought it was very, very well done, especially because yeah, she would be sort of relating to that character in that point. So I thought that was really just sort of, it felt very authentic. But she does have this son,
Hmm.
and she connects sort of with this director Castillo about the fact that his son is missing. And
Hmm.
I liked the parallels that you kind of did between the two of them and their various parenting situations. Um, Parenting does come into play a lot in
Hmm.
this story, and I liked it, and I liked how it added to the Gothic feel. Did you kind of always know it was? You said you wanted to write about a single mom.
Hmm.
Um, did you always know what Castillo's family situation was going to be?
I think it morphed a little bit as I was writing, um, and I think that's because when I start writing a book, I don't have a plan. I just kind of write and see what happens. And Javier's character really presented itself more as the book went on. And the original conception that I had of him was like of a person who was a little bit softer, but I think because he's sort of naturally authoritative, that changed, as I was writing the book, my perception of what his relationship with his family would have been like.
A lot of it really shocked me, I'll say. Not in a bad way. It was,
Mm-hmm.
it was a really good story, but it was the exact type of shock you really want from a horror book.
Oh,
I'll
I
say
love that.
that much. Yeah, I don't want that to sound bad to readers. When I say it shocked me, I mean that's a good thing. I did appreciate just the way that both Javier Castillo and Harry related to their families, and not only just their families, but also the other person in the relationship who would have been the other parent to their child.
Hmm.
Not going to give too much away, but also to their children itself. And I also liked that Javier's son was named Michael,
Hmm.
and Harry's son was named Gabriel.
Gabriel. Yeah.
Yeah, it was a very interesting way of looking at it, especially since Harry kind of fled a religious family, but ended up giving her son this name, which is associated with an angel as well.
Hmm.
And Javier writes her, and that's his son was Michael. Uh, in a way, were you sort of building them as foils for each other, or they just that's just kind of who they were?
I had this conception, and I do think I wrote it in the book for, I can't remember if I think I wrote it for Harry, but that both of them, when the children were born, they thought of them as angels, right? So you give them an angelic name. But yeah, I mean, in biblical lore, Michael has a flaming sword, so maybe he's not the most up and up character, and yeah, Michael Castillo is not the most moral character, shall we say.
When you talked about the different actors who worked in Castillo's movies, they were very interesting, and I really enjoyed the addition of Daniel as a character. Uh, was he another one who kind of came on set fully formed?
Yeah, and I think the interesting thing with that relationship is I think you get to see a slightly different, it's almost a parenting dynamic between him and Javier. Like he's obviously older than Javier's real son, but he kind of hero worships him in a way and sort of looks after him like he's a parent. And Javier's very sort of paternal toward him. So I think it gave an opportunity to show um like his parenting, but in a slightly different manner, a slightly different light. Um, but again, this thing that I always felt in Javier Castillo, which is that he wants to be worshipped, he wants to be adored, and like Daniel gives him that. He really, really looks up to him. He gives him something that he needs in some way.
Yeah, and I think that his house is kind of a shrine to himself in a way, even though he has other props. I did really, really love just the nod to Flight of the Navigator. I have to say that he had one of the ships from Flight of the Navigator, because I mean, for me, being a Gen Xer as well, that is such a iconic movie, but I don't know that it's as well known as, say, Goonies or other
Right.
movies of that age, which I know I say this all the time when I'm on this podcast, but I really just feel like a lot of those movies were intro to horror anyway. I
Hmm.
mean, even Flight of the Navigator, which was sort of a fantasy story, had some really horrific moments in it that were upsetting. And I did love that that was kind of part of his little sort of temple to horror movies in general.
Hmm. Yeah, I mean, you know, it's funny that you say that because I do think a lot of the films that we watched from that era, even if they weren't ostensibly horror, they do still have, mysterious elements or, again, sort of maybe horrific elements that, you know, are worked into the story. I do feel it was sort of the fabric of the types of things that we watched in the 80s.
And I think it's also kind of important to note that, and not to get too far away from it, but just kind of talking as somebody who grew up around the same time and, consumed these movies, is that PG-13 didn't exist.
Yes, it did not. Which
So,
I
like,
think,
yeah, you can watch like Gremlins and Ghostbusters, which, they're comedy horror, but they're kind of upsetting. And if you're going to consider them PG, along with other movies that are PG, and your parents take you to see them, like you're watching a horror movie. There's no way about it.
oh yeah, I mean, Gremlins and Ghostbusters came out the summer that I was 10 years old. And everybody I knew had seen them because they were PG, but I know for a fact that Gremlins was one of the films that and Indiana Jones and Temple of Doom that contributed to the PG-13 rating because parents took their kids to these movies and they were so horrified. I mean, Gremlins is an incredibly gory film. There's a gremlin that gets exploded in a microwave, and I don't think most people will be like, yeah, this is a family film.
It is a Christmas film. You can't tell me otherwise.
I know, but they released it in the summer, which is the most bizarre thing.
Anyway, yeah, so I did really appreciate that kind of giving sort of the time and place to the book. And I really liked Harry's relationship with Gabriel and just sort of how they bonded over these horror movies. But at the same time, it felt very real that at his age he was going to sort of be seeking approval from other people and other adults, and Castillo kind of came in this very vulnerable time, which was also COVID.
Hmm.
So you really just have all the good makings of just a lot of good drama, but also not only that, but also just pulling people out of their comfort, which is what horror does very, very well.
Yeah, and the relationship, I have a teenage son, so I think I do understand something about the relationship between moms and sons. Um, One of my best friends is a single mom, my sister's a single mom, and you definitely see that, like, if you're a single parent, you're always kind of trying to walk this line because you still have to be the parent, and there's a temptation, I think, to make that kid like your best friend. And you can't do that. You still have to be the authority figure in the relationship. And you see Harry trying to navigate this at a very difficult time, right? There's a pandemic. She's economically vulnerable. She feels very tied to this job because she can't, that's part of the thing that creates friction in the book is that she can't just up and leave this house when weird things start happening, right? Because that's what you always say when you're watching a movie, like, dum dum, why don't you just leave the house? But she can't leave because she has a son who she has to feed and she has to pay rent and she has to provide a life for him. And it's a time when there's really not a lot of jobs available. She had lost a job. And so she's very vulnerable in that sense. And to that extent, also Javier Castillo takes advantage of her because of that.
Definitely. So that said, what was your favorite part about writing this book?
I think I really did enjoy writing the relationship between Harry and Gabe. I like to write characters. I actually like characters more than plot, and it's one of the reasons why I don't plot because I write from who the characters are and writing that relationship and trying to communicate like a real relationship between a parent and a teen, you know, um and all the things that go along with that. I do think sometimes in books or movies you see very either really idealized relationships between parents and children, or you see just terribly traumatic relationships between parents and children, and you don't see, I think, what is the reality of parenting, which is just like there's rough and there's smooth, it goes up and down, and your child will like not talk to you for 3 weeks for reasons you will not understand, and then one day it'll be fine again. And trying to I think communicate the reality of what it's like to have a teenager. Um, because, parenting isn't all wins and isn't all fails. And I do feel like you see that a lot where it's like all of one thing.
So I don't want to give anything else away
Hmm.
because I have thoughts. Uh, but I did want to also just sort of give a nod to the way that you sort of portrayed how, I guess, the paparazzi sort of exploit trauma.
Hmm.
That is like a huge peeve of mine in general, how somebody's trauma becomes entertainment. and it just makes it worse. So, there is a bit of that in there where something happens and you get sort of the sense of just this group of people invading your life and closing in on an already traumatic situation. And it added very well to the horror
Y-
elements of the book.
Yeah, and there are layers to that, right? Because there's sort of like persistent paparazzi in the Castillo's lives in an earlier time, and then it kind of returns in this book. So it's um it's something I think that I've always been disturbed by. You know, I do think that there's something a little bit icky about like true crime culture, you know, and there's things about it that, just make you feel like, am I just looking at it? Like, am I like the person gawking at a car wreck? Should I know this much about this situation? Like, these are people's lives. And even if you take away like a traumatic event, which there are two major traumatic events in this book, that lead to like this paparazzi attention. But even if you take away a traumatic event, I remember seeing one time a video of it was in a documentary and about the paparazzi. Actually, I forget what it was called, but there was a video of Jessica Simpson getting out of a car at like the peak of her fame. And she literally could not move. The only reason she could move is because she had a bodyguard in front of her pushing people aside. But it was like the stereotype of the person who steps out of the car and like 150 flash bulbs go off. And I just thought, nobody signs up for this. Nobody thinks that, they're going to be surrounded by cameras all the time. And it's so much more intrusive now with cell phones because it's not just professional photographers who are taking a picture of you. It's like somebody who saw you in a Starbucks. And there's something to me like so icky and intrusive about that. And I think, yeah, that plays into the story for sure.
Well, once again, thank you very much. This was a really good one. I will read a cereal box if you write a cereal
Oh,
box.
thank
That's
you.
how much I love
Thank
your
you.
books. When is this one due out?
This will be out on May 14th.
So everybody, check out The House That Horror Built by Christina Henry. Check out all of Christina Henry's books, and if she writes a cereal box, check that out too. Are you working on anything else at the moment?
Yeah, I'm working on two things which I can't announce yet. Sort of in process, but yeah, I'm uh I'm always working on something.
All right. So once again, this was Jessica, and we are going to close this chapter of Turn the Page.
It's time to close this chapter of Turn the Page. Join us for the next episode.